Welcome to this third in the Movie Matters talks. This one focused on the film series I programmed, Heroic Journeys, Black Histories on Screen. So today I'm going to be talking about The Loving Story. That's a documentary. It was a collaboration between HBO and Augusta Films, which is an independent filmmaking production company. The date of that release was 2011. It runs 1 hour and 17 minutes. And when you look at the flyer online for this film series, you will know how you can access this film. All right, The Loving Story then is a feature documentary. The director is Nancy Buirski. This is her first film. Not that she's a rookie or a novice at matters of film. She's and visual materials. Buirski is very visually grounded in her background. Photographer, a film producer, and the founder of Full Frame Documentary Festival in 1998. So she's been doing that for a long time, and you will know, if you're a regular film viewer of documentaries, whether it's CNN documentaries or whatever, in the last several years, and I do mean several, documentaries have taken a major place in production and in people's viewing, and also for distributors. So documentaries are very, very important. They always have been, but they have reached a wide public now. All right, so Buirski's documentary approach is informed by her photographic background and also simultaneously her sense of justice. What she does is to revive the Lovings story as a case study with educational purpose, and the film style is steeped in storytelling and metaphor. So let me talk first about the pre-credit imagery. There's a photo of a couple. Those are the Lovings, though we don't know that yet. We see their back, and that segues into footage of them walking, still shot from behind. Importantly, they are holding hands. So we have the appearance here of an affectionate couple, that affectionate couple in the film title. Not only is this the loving story, it is a loving story. There's a voiceover accuser over this imagery, the Caroline County, Virginia Circuit Court Judge Leon Bazile ruling that he, God, separated the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and placed them on separate continents, shows that he did not intend for the races to mix, A series of titles appears on the screen, and I'm going to go through them. Virginia, 1958. Interracial marriage is illegal, punishable by jail. This is the law in 24 states across the country. Newlyweds, Mildred Jeter Loving, a colored woman, and Richard Perry Loving, a white man, are arrested for committing the crime of mixed marriage. They are convicted of felony charges and banished from Virginia. The Lovings spend the next 9 years trying to get home. So there you have the bare facts in titles on the screen as a prologue to the film. The music on the soundtrack is the spiritual uplift song. Many of you will know it. You may have sung it at some point in a choir, Going Home. It's poetic, it's lyrical, it's also sentimental, especially this version on the soundtrack sung by a boys' choir. So what this pre-credit imagery does is to establish the mood as well as the focus of a real-life narrative. All right, I want to begin with the Loving Story as a social case study. The story is set in the Jim Crow South, Virginia, mid-20th century, 1958. Richard Loving, white, and Mildred Jeter, Black/Native American, drive 80 miles out of state to D.C., the District of Columbia, to marry. They return to rural Caroline County in Virginia. The local sheriff arrests them in a horrific scenario in the middle of the night, barging, breaking into the house, breaking into the bedroom. What's their crime? Cohabitation. Now, this is all under the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. That was an act to stop the dilution of the races, no mixing. Now, I want to use this term that's really crucial to this notion and this fear around the dilution of races. The term is miscegenation. Miscegenation, spelled exactly as it sounds. Miscegenation means the fear of racial mixing. Specifically, by definition, marriage or cohabitation between a man and a woman of different races, likely to result in mixed race children. A historian in the film refers to the 1924 Racial Integrity Act as code for white supremacy turned into a fetish. A Black historian in the film, who also happens to have been a childhood friend of Richard Loving, puts it this way: the Loving case, being about love and sex, is actually what segregation was all about, and sex is always, always there. The 1958 network television footage of the Virginia governor's rationale at the time is very telling. The mixing of the races will destroy education. And stop. An old woman chewing gum says, "We are very satisfied with the condition, would like to keep it as it is." A Klansman in robes at a mall, open daylight, smirks directly into the lens of the news camera. So segregation, in other words, is an open secret, and it runs deep into the culture. The Lovings are extraordinary people, poor, unassuming people, romantic with each other, caring, and non-judgmental. Mildred is tall, lovely, mixed race, Black, Native American. On the marriage license, she identifies herself as Indian. Richard is blonde, a rugged construction worker, quiet, a man of few words. He could pass for a stereotype of a redneck, but he isn't. In 1967, an eloquent Richard instructs the lawyers for the Supreme Court case. Tell the Supreme Court I love my wife, and it is just not fair that I cannot live with her in Virginia. What could be more articulate than that and loving? So the Loving documentary as a structure is a compilation. It's also curatorial. That is, Buirski really is a curator in the way she has searched out archival film footage, news, television news broadcasting, and other footage I'm going to talk about, and photography, interesting, wonderful photographs. So it's a looking back on her part, a recovering of the past, archival photos, film footage. These segments are held together by intertitles, by voiceovers, and the voiceovers include Richard, include a lot of Mildred, and witnesses, including her daughter. So we see these segments, home, on screen. That means rural Virginia, Caroline County. Exiled. In the film, the deputy sheriff says, "Our jail was hell." Sneaking back. Living separately with parents. The climate, racism, entrenched segregation. The case, that is, the Supreme Court case. 1967, landmark ruling on marriage equality. Okay, that's the shape of the film. I want to talk about Hope Harden, and particularly her 16mm footage of the Lovings that she filmed in 1965, 2 years prior to the Supreme Court case, which was, as I just noted, 1967. What's her shooting style? It's known as observational cinema. Very popular at the time and quite experimental in theory and sometimes in practice, known quite often as cinema verite, film truth. The emphasis in observational shooting style is on picture logic over word logic, imagery over words. The filmmaker and the camera, in other words, are looking in on people's lives. In this instance, in Hope Ryden's 16 millimeter footage, the dailiness of Mildred, Richard, their daughter, and their two sons. Their very humble home, their warm family. Richard is feeding wood into the furnace that appears to be right in the center of their living play quarters. Now, I want to emphasize here Hope Ryden's background before she filmed The Lovings in 1965. She had made several documentaries observing animal behavior, all kinds of animal behavior. Wonderful work. So the observational camera technique seems neutral. What's the problem? The Lovings cooperate. But what we see is that they're not entirely comfortable before Ryden's camera. And I want to quote film scholar Bill Nichols, who has written extensively about film and also about documentary particularly. He has raised a key issue about observational cinema, observational camera, that technique. I'm quoting him now. Has the filmmaker intruded upon people's lives in ways that will irrevocably alter them, perhaps for the worse, in order to make a film? What will you do to make a film? All right, in an interview with Nancy Buirski, our director here in 2012 for Filmmaker magazine, Buirski reflects on the lucky accident of locating Ryden's 1965 footage. She did this, or the lucky accident happened, when she was doing background interview with Loving's two lawyers. And now I'm quoting Buirski. The lawyers, they both remembered a woman named Hope Ryden coming to film them and the Lovings in 1965. Had I not gotten that black-white film footage, the film would have been, that is, her film, would have been a much more conventional cobbling together of a bit of footage from here and a little bit from there, and some kind of overall narration representing but not being Mildred's point of view. I realized immediately what I could do to create a much more narrative approach to the story and thread the footage through it as though we were living it through it with the Lovings. There's only 20 minutes of that footage in the film. I struggled to keep as much of the footage in place as possible, meaning not cut it into the scenes. Just let them play out as real scenes. I really wanted the audience to feel what the Lovings were feeling and feel the time. So there is Buirski's intention for her documentary. Relatability, empathy. And so there's a lot of sense of emotion and feeling in the film. Now, Buirski's film project, that is, The Loving Story, was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Not easy to get a project grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US. Very heavy-going application process. You have to really demonstrate that you have the resources, the theory, the wherewithal to render the project. So in the post-credit sequence at the end of this film, we see the advisors include academics, several, and also, you might be surprised, and I'm not surprised at all, a credit for Martin Scorsese, that prolific American filmmaker who championed independent filmmaking in documentaries and features. In other words, narrative storytelling techniques applied, in this case, to archival sources. I now want to move on to Buirski's use of found photographs of the Lovings. And I want to identify photography, no longer living, named Gray Villette, a South African white man who would have been familiar with apartheid in South Africa. In the US, where he lived and worked until his death, he became a notable photojournalist for Life magazine. Now, Life magazine was the first American news magazine to be a photographic news magazine. Villette has a distinguished background. He covered the Cuban Revolution. He's in the car with Fidel Castro entering Havana in 1958. He takes extraordinary photographs, all black and white, because there's a kind of truth-telling element in black and white photographs. They seem to be more truthful than color. Now that's an illusion, and I could dispute that, but not the place to do that right now. Villette in 1965 spent 2 weeks with the Lovings. He created a visual essay of the Lovings for Life magazine that appeared in Life's March 18th, 1966 issue. The visual essays, with some text, but all these superb black and white photographs, is titled The Crime of Being Married. We see Villette's wonderful photographs of an affectionate family, happy kids, a couple enjoying TV together. These are not the typical kind of photographs that you would want to have taken of you. I wouldn't, thank you. There are photos of Richard and Mildred with black friends at the popular local drag races. Buirski enhances Villette's photographs of the drag races with rock and roll music. In other words, that's a narrative device. Apply rock and roll music to these wonderful photographs of the local drag races. And so what these photographs do is to emphasize the racial mixing in 1950s Virginia. Richard's whiteness is validated by his friendships with black local people. Local neighbors testify in the film to blacks and whites helping each other out. It's only in those rules, in that legislation, that one must not mix. Villette's photo essay of the Lovings did not make it to the front cover of Life magazine. It was buried in the pages, somewhere in the middle of the magazine. The cover photo for that issue is of Barbra Streisand posing with her dog. Of course, celebrity, and Barbra Streisand has become at that point very famous. But you see what's going on here. It's a certain kind of celebrity on the cover of the cover. There is no celebrity in the extraordinary Lovings. In retrospect, two women, Lily Rothman and Liz Ronk, write this. Photography played an important role in the civil rights movement of the 20th century, communicating the urgency of the situation to Americans and people around the world who might have otherwise been ignorant. Nancy Buirski herself is quoted, publicity, and she calls it publicity, that is, the Villette photo essay. Publicity like the life story probably did do a lot for the Lovings case. It also caused people to be angry. Who would those readers be? Buirski's documentary approach reflects on the past, but she softens that kind of anger. How does she do it? She extracts footage from the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave that famous speech, "I have a dream." What she extracts is footage, and it's great footage, of Black people arriving by train. They're not angry. They're dressed for the occasion. They look wonderful. Men in suits, women in dresses. In another article, Liz Ronk writes of the star-studded concert in 1963, known as Salute to Freedom, to raise funds for that march on Washington. Martin Luther King is present. So is writer James Baldwin, who performed Nina Simone, Ray Charles, Johnny Mathis. Life magazine never published Gray Villette's extraordinary photographs of this event, event. Why not? Why not, indeed? I think we get an inkling of this, and we can see that there is a fear of, on the publication of Life magazine's part, as to what would happen to the magazine sales. Bernard Cohen, who was present in the loving home when Mildred died in 2008, recalls, "This was a terrible time in America. Racism was rife, and this was the de jure vestige." What he means by de jure, by legal right of racism. There was a lot of de facto racism, in fact. But the law was the last on the books manifested of slavery in America. All right, let's briefly look now at the law case known as Loving versus Virginia, Virginia being the state. The two lawyers, Philip Hirschkopf and Bernard Cohen, both associated with the United States Civil Liberties Union. They take up the Loving case in 1964. Footage of Cohen and Hirschkopf in Buirski's documentary are wonderful. They're young lawyers about to make their mark. They're compelling, bright, lively. They're articulate before the network television cameras. Hearing young lawyer Bernard Cohen read Mildred's letter to U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy is astonishing in Mildred's clarity of purpose, beautifully clear and articulate. Hearing Mildred speak is a lesson in grace. I just wanted to go home. Home, of course, in Virginia is not a pastoral, rural countryscape. It's not the place where beautiful thoroughbred horses are bred and where they roam. This is very hard-scrabble land. There's stunning archival footage of the interior of the U.S. Supreme Court, where few trespass. The fluid panning camera explores the formality of the highest court in the land, the site of the legal oral argument heard before Chief Justice Earl Warren. Earl wrote the legal summary, and here it is, June 12th, 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, and I quote, "The fact that Virginia prohibits only interracial marriages involving white persons demonstrates that the racial classifications must stand on their own justification as measures designed to maintain white supremacy, period." In old age, Cohen and Hirschkopf, they're still looking wonderful. They reflect on the era and the case that made their careers. Now, Director Buirski, in an interview elsewhere, says, "This is a love story. The Lovings, acted on principle. They were not out there to change history. Yet Mildred and Richard became famous in press, in television news, in case law study to this very day." Buirski referred to Lovings as moral heroes, and I think that's a very good way to look at them. When their daughter talks about her parents, it's an insider's knowledge as the little girl who witnessed her parents, and this is over black and white footage. There's a pan of the cell wall where the local police, in Mildred's words, locked us up. It's pockmarked. It's a kind of museum, if you like, of grim racist history. Richard on camera, emphasized by slow motion effect, a narrative filmmaking effect, says, "A few white people, a few colored, somebody talked." The color footage of Mildred and Richard viewing Gray Villette's black and white photos goes like this. Mildred says, "He," meaning Richard, "went to his parents' home. I went to mine. A married couple separated under the law." Richard's mother, Lola, tells the reporter, they were very happy. So Buirski's documentary looks back, it pulls the past into the present. Now, in hindsight, the implications of what happened are softened and also expose racial prejudice and ignorance. The final image in the film is of a smiling Mildred with her dates, 1939 to 2008. There's fitting gospel music on the soundtrack, The Staple Singers. So The Loving Story was a co-production, as I said at the beginning, with HBO Documentary Films. It's dedicated in the loving memory to Richard Loving, Mildred Loving, Donald Loving, Sidney Jeter. Sidney Jeter was Mildred's son before she and Richard had their daughter and their son, Donald. 2 sons are dead. When was the HBO film, this broadcast on HBO? Well, February 14th, Valentine's Day. What a perfect day for a loving story. And of course, it's Black History Month, February 2012. So we have a love story and a history lesson all the same. There's a teacher's guide that was developed to go with this film. It's titled Teaching Tolerance. It was a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. The topics that students, teachers can explore are the right to love as a basic human right, love as an inalienable right, civil liberties, and the judicial processes specifically related to the Loving case. And I want to note here a very important conjunction or relationship between the Loving's history and their case, their legal case in the civil rights era, and the implications for gay marriage rights today. In 2007, the 40th anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling, Mildred issued this statement. Articulate as usual. I believe all Americans, no matter their race, no matter their sexual orientation, should have that same freedom to marry. Government has no business imposing some people's religious beliefs over others, especially if it denies people's civil rights. In 2013, the Loving Story documentary received the Peabody Award. This is a very prestigious award. The Peabody Award is given for the distinguished achievement and service by broadcasters, cable and webcasters, producing organizations, and individuals like Nancy Buirski. The Emmys gave the film 3 nominations, but I particularly find important for our purposes today is that it had a nomination for Outstanding Editing. Again, editing is the key to compilation documentary with social purpose. Buirski credits her editor and producer Elizabeth James elsewhere. The intellectual part of it, the academic historical part of it, we were grounded in that. We did our research. The nice grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities required very scholarly proposals. So the narrative effects, visual effects, make the lessons and the lovings interesting, very interesting subjects, in keeping with Buirski's take on documentary as storytelling. And I'm going to quote her here as I end this talk today. Buirski said, I think documentaries really have to be dramatic stories and unfold in that sense, and that's what makes them so powerful. There are lots of people who approach documentary very differently, just the facts, and are happy to let the information breathe more than the story. But I fall back in the narrative vein. Not that I approach it as fiction film, but I certainly appreciate the story arc of fiction and therefore try to bring that into the documentary realm as well. And of course, influenced by her acquaintance with Martin Scorsese. So I want to recommend a feature film called Loving. Director Jeff Nichols also wrote the film. 2016. It's a feature-length film. Outstanding performances by Australian actor Joe Edgerton and Black Irish-born actress Ruth Negga. Just brilliant performances. Now, Loving, that feature film, was inspired by Buirski's documentary and Gray Villette's photographs of the Lovings. Buirski is a producer, as well as actor Colin Firth, of the feature film Loving. So they're behind Jeff Nichols' feature film. I want to say that one film isn't better than the other. They're both really fine films. The Loving Story documentary and Loving, the feature film. Really fine films. There's a very interesting difference, I think, that I will just simply point out in Loving, the feature film, is that an actor plays the part of Gray Villette, the photographer, who goes to the Lovings and engages with Richard and gets them on side. It's really a lovely little scene. So that's it for this talk. 2 weeks, Thursday, November 5th. The focus of my talk will be the amazing documentary on the amazing person, Bryan Stevenson. The documentary is called True Justice, Bryan Stevenson's Fight for Equality. And so that's it tonight from the museum. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you.